Let people start filing in. So by my watch, it is now 3 p.m. Eastern time. So hello and welcome to everyone just filing in. I'll make sure I type this out for people that come late or that missed this specific part. This is a Zoom webinar, so you don't have to worry about being seen or heard. Your mics and cameras are disabled by default. So you'll be able to see and hear the panelists and what's on the screen, but otherwise you won't have to worry about interrupting us. If you do want to ask a question or just have a discussion, there's two primary ways you can do that. If you just want to have a chat or discuss something, you can use the chat feature. Just make sure in the to area that you select all panelists and attendees if you want everyone to see it. By default, it'll just be seen by us in the panelists window. If you have a question for the panelists, feel free to use the Q&A function of the Zoom dashboard. For the Q&A, you can ask questions anonymously, and you can also view existing questions. You can upvote those, and you can add your own comments to them. So those are the two main ways to interact, but we highly encourage you to use the Q&A for any answer that you want to get out of this. So without further ado, I want to hand it off to Julia Finocchi.
Good afternoon and happy Friday. I'm Julia Finocchi, Associate Director at Acros, and I would like to welcome you to the first of the fall series of the Coffee Break, which is an opportunity for Acros to discuss important and timely issues in a more casual and interactive environment. We know that all of you are at the beginning of your fall semester, and we know that you are incredibly busy. So we thank you for taking the time to join us today as we close out our week. As always, we are hopeful that our technology will not fail us. This is a very large Zoom meeting, and we at Acros remain at the mercies of our home Wi-Fi. You may use the chat freely while on the webinar. However, if you have a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A section to ask that question rather than the chat, and we will get to it in the Q&A. Please note which panelist you are asking if the question is specific to them. Now I'd like to introduce and welcome our panelists. We have Leroy Rooker, Senior Fellow and Acros employee at the National Office. He is the FERPA Doctor. Also, Jonathan Helm, Registrar at Baylor University, and Doug McKenna, just down the road from us, the University Registrar at George Mason University. Before we jump into our discussion, I want to direct you to our COVID practice pages. We have combined the resources and guidance pages into a single reference page that includes all of our COVID-related guidance, endorsing alternative practices for institutions in times of crisis. It's important to note that more than ever before, as you implement policy and practice changes, whether temporary or permanent, you incorporate clear communication and transparency with all stakeholders, an approach consistent with your mission and philosophy and consistency of application in the best interests of your students and campus. To build our guidance, we are using established Acros standards and guidance, re-envisioning them through the lens of the current COVID-19 crisis, and consulting with subject matter experts from our board of directors and amongst the membership. We are here to ensure that Acros brings you the tools and information that you need to serve your institution and your students in this dynamically changing environment. It seems as if COVID time, the acceleration of changes and the compression of decision-making and the implementation timelines is here to stay for a while at least. Acros is here to help. A reminder, particularly for the attendees on this call, that the latest FERPA guide is available in the bookstore. We have talked with many members in the last several months, and while our in-person meetings have been suspended in the near term, we know that you and your staff continue to have professional development needs. The month ahead is packed with programming that will help you to do your jobs now. We have launched a new communication called This Month at Acros to share with you all that we have planned. You can also check the calendar on our website at any time. The next several coffee breaks are now open for registration, and we have many more in the works. You can expect to see them at least weekly through much of the fall. Additionally, registration is open for Registrar 101 and the Essentials of Strategic Enrollment Management. These online courses start on September 14th and are on the strong foundation your staff needs to help them weather the current environment. Space is limited, so be sure to register soon. Other upcoming, on September 14th, an update on Acros strategic planning process comes from the President, Jack Miner. And then on September 23rd and 30th, 2 webinars from the experts on the SPEEDY Committee who want to help your office get up to speed in digital data transfer using SPEEDY or some other process, which, as we have seen, is more important than ever for maintaining service levels during a crisis. And the Acro research continues with 2 expected reports this month. The first on stranded credits, and the second from our work group that has developed guidance and best practices for closing institutions pertaining to student education records. We will also continue this fall on our COVID-19 impact practice snapshot surveys. Later this month, look for the first fall survey on the impact of 2020 disruptions on work and career. Now let's get on to it. Next slide. Okay, our first question has to do with FERPA and Zoom. The past 6 months have been one of continual disruption. One of the few constants, though, during this time has been the presence of Zoom, WebEx, etc. So let me ask the panelists, and I'll start with Leroy. What are some of the potential FERPA compliance issues one might need to consider when using this medium? Leroy?
Yeah, thank you, Julia, and welcome everyone. There are different issues. I've gotten many emails on this this subject, which is one of the reasons we wanted to make sure and cover it today. But questions such as, are these Zoom recordings, or if we use Zoom, is it subject to FERPA? What if we share it inside the classroom later? What if we share it outside the classroom? What are some of the things we have to think about? So the first thing, just starting with the reminder of what's an education record. So education records are those records that are directly related to the student and maintained by the institution or a party acting for the institution. So maybe your vendor. And so when we talk about the Zoom or WebEx, or we are looking at the potential to have an education record, but it depends on whether or not these are recorded. So if these sessions, if you record the session, it's going to be an education record if it gets maintained by the institution. It is going to be, and it, depending on whether or not students are a part of the of what's recorded. So example of that would be if you record, if you have a Zoom class and don't record anything, you don't have an education record. If you have a Zoom class and it focuses on the instructor, then again, you don't have a education record. But if you focus on the instructor and the students, then you are generally going to have an education record if you have interaction where students are identifiable in it. So if you're shooting it from the back of the room and you've got just the back of heads and otherwise it's just the instructor, that's not generally going to be rise to the level of an education record. But on the other hand, if you've got students who are participating, you're having discussions and you're recording it, then you are going to have an education record if in that instance. Then the question is, if you have that, what can you do with it? Can you use it in another class? And generally, the answer to that is no, unless it's that you're using in the same class at a different time. But if it's going to be shown outside the classroom and it's an education record, then it is going to be subject to FERPA, and you're going to have to limit what you would do with that. On the other hand, as we talked earlier, if you have if you simply record the instructor speaking and there aren't students identified in it, then again, you can use that over and over again and anywhere you want to use it. The key in all of this is, one, is it are students identifiable, and is it recorded and maintained? If so, they're identifiable, it's maintained, it's going to be an education record. If it's not maintained, it's not recorded, you just are doing live transmissions and live class, you're not recording it, even though students would be identifiable, it's not going to be subject to FERPA because it's not an education record. So that's kind of a quick overview of it. Jonathan and Doug could speak more, let them speak more to the practical aspect of it on the campus.
Thanks, Leroy. I think exactly what you just described has been the basis for all of our conversations at Baylor around this topic, really starting with the question, is there a record being created? Is it an education record? Are there personally identifiable information contained in that record? And it's really across multiple platforms that we're using on campus has really been the basis for all of the discussion that we've had in this regard. And so it's been good, and I will say I appreciate my colleagues around campus asking the questions and not always just assuming that that intuitively they know the answers to those. So I think it's worked out pretty well as far as being able to provide the guidance and feedback that they need to make good decisions around these things.
I'd agree with Jonathan. I'm Doug McKenna. I'm at George Mason University. We've got a mix of in-person sections. About 40% of our class sections have some face-to-face component. And as one of the outgrowths of the physical distancing that we enacted as part of our safe return to campus plans, obviously the number of students that can be in a classroom at the same time has been reduced. And so about 40% of our sections have some component of face-to-face, but that only is about 18% of our registrations. And that's flipped from a normal year. And so one of the things that we have done as a result of the physical distancing requirements is that many more of our face-to-face sections have been hybridized in some way. So the Monday class meets in person, half the section meets on Monday, and half the section meets on Wednesday, and then they switch. And so in order to schedule those have been they've been split into two sections. And they're not cross-listed because it's the same class really, but they are linked. And so enabling the students who are participating remotely, either synchronously or asynchronously, we have facilitated the use of Zoom recordings. And so I think there's a question in the Q&A about combining the same section or different sections into one Blackboard entity. And we've done that. And enabled the students who are not participating in person on the alternating days to view the recordings of the class that was made while they were remote. And so combining those, to Leroy's point about if it focuses on the faculty member, great. Although Leroy, you did say one thing, that if you've got this recording, it's just the faculty, you can use it over and over. well, there are no FERPA issues there, but there might be IP issues from a faculty perspective. Different conversation for a different coffee break. But to get to this point about when you combine a section within the LMS, under FERPA, that makes it one class. And this is really, I'm asking that with an uptick on the end so that Leroy can respond to that part of it. But we've done that in order to facilitate the physical distancing limitations that we've enacted primarily on the Fairfax campus, but on all of Mason's campuses in the United States. So.
And just to chime in on something Doug just mentioned, I think we went in, like he describes to the term, expecting, you know, some number of fully online classes, some number of hybrid classes, and then some number that we were going to accommodate fully face-to-face. And so additional questions and planning, fortunately we realized it before we hit this point in time, but even for those faculty that plan to be fully face-to-face, we did schedule recordings in those rooms, and it was important because in some cases we've had students either in isolation or quarantine in a way that required them to join remotely for a class that was planned to be fully face-to-face, but it's just not possible for a student to follow through and be in that class in person. So it was good and fortunate that we had thought through some of that and had those instructors familiar with this and aware of it before they hit that point in time, even though, you know, from the beginning, they were planning on that not being a primary mode of delivery. So.
Yeah, and I think institutions are gonna, unfortunately, see more and more of that through the fall, where students are sick and you don't want them to come to class, but you also don't want them to miss class. And so you want to be able to enable that participation in a way that both supports the student's learning, but also doesn't violate any federal laws. It's one of those things we try to avoid.
So for both of you, it sounds like you record these sessions. Is that the general rule that you do? And also for those students, you mentioned the students who might be ill and not able to be there. Is that, are they able to attend live on those, or is that something that you record and show them later type of thing?
So in our case, and I should remember the number of classrooms offhand, but our IT staff were able to set up a schedule for auto recording of class sections in those classes based on the start and end times of those. And so that's done, but it's then under the control of the instructor as to whether to share that through our LMS or not. So it's, all of them are being recorded. There were a few small number of instructors that opted out of that, but the vast majority are. But so it's created and it would be a record, maybe not an education record, but a record that we have. But then it's up to the instructor to decide to share that through the LMS. As far as those students that aren't able to attend in person for some reason, isolation or quarantine, to Leroy's question, it's really, I think, been a combination of some being able to join synchronously and others at times watching a recording, something along those lines after the fact. So I think that part, at least for us, has varied instructor by instructor, section by section, and potentially even student by student, depending on their individual circumstances.
And that's largely the same at Mason as well. We have classrooms that are designated as university classrooms, as many institutions have, and then there are a bunch of other spaces on campus that often get scheduled, so departmentally run spaces, et cetera. For the university classrooms, we spent a lot of time over the summer assessing those spaces and doing a gap analysis of what technology they would need in order to provide synchronous remote learning opportunities, and working closely with ITS, and we have a couple of different space committees on campus. ITS is our IT services. That's what information technology, and you're following, never mind. So working with ITS to map out what we needed to do. And then we were actually, it took a long time to get the supplies. Everybody ordered webcams. And so that's one of the things that, like, for a little while, they were not webcams to be found. And so it literally all the way up to the start of the semester, we were outfitting rooms in order to enable recording of lectures, recording of discussions, and then it's up to the instructor if they want to record. They're not set up, as Jonathan indicated at Baylor, they're not set up to auto record. It's up to the individual instructor. And then it's also up to how the section is scheduled, whether there's a synchronous component or a synchronous expectation versus asynchronous, so the students can view the thing later. And obviously that has a say in whether or not the in-person part is recorded or not, because if it's not, you can't have asynchronous. So those are some of the things that we worked through trying to outfit our spaces in order to enable just the different kinds of learning that our students are experiencing this fall.
Yep. And I think just a final note, I know Jonathan mentioned the LMS system and having it there. Again, keeping in mind, being on the LMS system is perfectly fine if it's not an education record, so it's only the instructor. And also, if it is an education record, so long as it's only shared with that particular classroom and the students in that classroom. So it's just an important little side note there. So Julie, I don't know if we have any questions that anyone has.
We do. We have one here that I think is interesting that's been upvoted a few times. It is, we allow auditors in our class with the permission of the instructor. No record, no credit, no charge. How would FERPA apply in such a situation, for example, providing a contact list for all students in the course to an auditor?
So I missed the first part of that. What was the?
It was, we allow auditors in our class with the permission of the instructor.
Okay, so someone's auditing the class. They're not going to be a student. And I don't know if I presume if they're in there, they're not enrolled. If that's the case. Now, if they're enrolled at the institution, they're just auditing the class, then it depends on whether any records are being created on the person who's auditing.
Doug or Jonathan?
I can't really speak from any experience on that particular issue. By policy, we would not have that situation at Baylor of someone auditing the class without being registered in that status. Now, I must admit, we don't monitor who necessarily is sitting in a given classroom at a given time. So, you know, if we're following our policy, we should be avoiding, I think, the situation that was being described in the question. But, you know, that's up to some extent to instructors recognizing and enforcing that approach.
That's the same at Mason. We don't let students, there's a policy that says that all participants in a class have to be registered, whether they're auditing credit, non-credit, anything. We need to know who's in the classroom. Where that also gets fun is instructor allowed guests, which you know, is a different scenario. It's a different situation than someone who's going to be expected to be there consistently throughout the semester, just with no record of them being there. So.
Okay.
This can happen, I mean, it sort of happens on the other end of the equation too, with guest speakers and others that may not have a university defined role for instruction for a given class, but who, you know, now in most of those cases, I doubt they're going to have access to a record, but so that's probably outside of FERPA, but they may have access to the classroom on a given day as a guest speaker or something along those lines.
Well, that's the other thing. We control so much of our access to the LMS, to the portal, to anything based on registration and association into the class. So my question to the questioner is, if a student is expected to audit the class, but they're not registered, how are they given access to Blackboard or any of the learning materials or any of the anything? And this is obviously beyond the scope of today's discussion. I'm just curious. So
I can't answer that for who asked the question. I do know that within our LMS, there is the ability for an instructor to grant access to regions of things that to someone who has the university but isn't registered for the class. And where I think it comes up, and we've provided guidance when asked and general guidance beyond that, is a lot of times we'll have a student completing an incomplete and may need in a subsequent term access to a given lecture, something along those lines, to be able to complete that incomplete. So we do, I mean, beyond COVID, we have had those sorts of dynamics at times. The hope and desire is to provide the feedback and information needed to instructors so that they're handling that appropriately.
Okay, we have one more question that I'd like to ask. I hope it's a quick answer for you. Can faculty require students show their faces during the Zoom class? Hey, Roy.
So they could require them to if they want to do that. I mean, that's like being in the classroom. You know, FERPA addresses this. One of the things that we did in the 2009 regulations was address the idea of being anonymous in the classroom. If somebody opted out of directory information, that they couldn't use that as a means of saying you can't put my name on a sign-in sheet in class, or call my name, or do these different things. And we made it clear in the regulations, you can't be anonymous in the classroom. So it would not be, FERPA would not interfere with a policy such as that. If they want to say, you got to be visible in the classroom, I guess it's somebody wants to put a bag over their head or something, you could say you can't do it. And so I don't think there's necessarily a problem with that. Again, keeping in mind that if you're recording it and creating an education record, then you just have to be cognizant of what the limitations on reusing them.
Okay.
To Leroy's point, I agree. I don't know that it's necessarily a FERPA issue, but as Leroy just pointed out, you may, in effect, you may be creating an education record where, by requiring that, where otherwise there wouldn't be based on the content of what's recorded. So it may be an unintended consequence of requiring that, that you're in effect creating an education record that then FERPA would be applicable to.
Right. If it's recorded, if it's live Zoom and not being recorded, then it's just being in the classroom.
Okay, I have one question that's been upvoted several times, and we're going to pose that one, and then we're going to move on to the next scenario and come back to some of these at the end. Could a recording that meets the definition of an education record be shared with students enrolled in the same class when the students receiving the recording were absent?
So it's being shared with a student who's been absent.
Correct. That's the way I'm reading the question.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, that would not be a problem. I mean, as long as they're enrolled in the class, then it's they're still a part of it. So that's that wouldn't be a problem at all.
Okay.
You will have that. I mean, that's part of the reason, and as Jonathan and Doug have both pointed out, part of the reason that they're doing these on their campus and recording this is so that, or at least able to share it with those students who may be out for a period of time with an illness and be able to do that. So that's perfectly fine.
It is
Okay.
always nice to hear you say things like that, Leroy, because I was like, what's he gonna say? What's he gonna say? Oh, no.
We all hang on to Leroy's every word, so.
I like to scare Doug.
Okay, let's go on to our next issue. You can advance the slide, Michael. COVID on campus. So as colleges have welcomed back students, a number of issues surrounding cases of COVID and COVID testing have emerged. This has left numerous questions concerning the treatment of COVID information, including contact tracing and how this should be handled. So would you three of you discuss and unpack some of the issues surrounding FERPA, including contact tracing, recording and reporting information with the health department, and communicating with students and faculties in your campus community? And we'll start with you again, Leo. Give us the big picture.
All right. Yeah, so this again, I've gotten lots of questions about this one and done a webinar or two on it. But the issue here, we always go back to the same issue, which is FERPA deals with education records. So that's what you would look at. Same thing here. Are you creating education records? And if you are, what can you do with them, or what can't you do with them? And so as you look at it now, and Doug and Jonathan can give the practical aspect, just quickly mention the different pieces here relate to, again, whether or not you're creating a record. So if you have a classroom where you take temperature and before the student goes in, and if the student has a temperature, it's like, yeah, yours is 101, you can't come in. You're not dealing with education records there. On the other hand, if you're recording what the temperature is on each student, then, and maintaining that, then you're going to have an education record. If you come across a student who is maybe or aware of a student who has contracted COVID and you're participating in contact tracing, you need to disclose that. There are a couple of different things that come into play here. One is we are sharing that with your health department, for example, is something that could be done under the health or safety emergency exception in FERPA. And that exception in 9931 and then details in 99.36 in the regulations talks about if there is a health or safety emergency, the disclosing information to appropriate parties related to that emergency is a permissible thing. So we clearly have the president has designated this as a pandemic and a health emergency. So you have a clear path to being able to use that exception in 9931 for health or safety emergency. What you do have to do, however, is record any disclosure under health or safety emergency. You have to record that in that student's record. So if you provide that specific on the student to, say, the health department, you would have to record that in that student's education record. Likewise, if you have situation where you have a student and maybe your student's tested positive, was in class yesterday, today they test positive, you become aware of that. What can you do with that information? Then if it's simply, and you have that information in an education record, can you disclose that to, say, faculty members, say the faculty instructors for that particular student in the class that the student's been attending? And under the school official exception, you could disclose that information. If you don't disclose it in personally identifiable form, it's not you're not disclosing it. You're not disclosing an education record. You simply say a student who was in your class yesterday has tested positive, so that they're aware of that. You could also, the instructor could notify those students who were in the classroom with that student and say, this is a student has tested positive. And again, because you're not naming a student, you're not disclosing from an education record. On the other hand, you may, under health or safety emergency, you may, the instructor may know that, say that this student was sitting next to two other students, and there's one on either side. They, for whatever reason, weren't social distancing, and so then you may feel it important to, in particular, notify those students about the student who is sitting next to them. That is something you could do under health or safety emergency. Again, you'd have to record that piece, but it would be permissible based on the determination at the institution. So the way the department, and this was a change, this is something added in the 2009 regulations, is that institutions can make the call on the health or safety emergency and any disclosures there, but they need to be able to record what the articulable and significant threat was to the health or safety of the student or others in the particular disclosure. So that's a couple of things. One other I'll mention, because I get this also, is, well, how does HIPAA apply in all of this? And when it comes to disclosing information from either health or treatment records at an institution, or information relating to health that's in an education record, the HIPAA's privacy rule does not apply at the post-secondary institution, and that's right out of the HIPAA regulations. What does apply is FERPA. So as you move forward in thinking about what can we do with this information, it is going to be FERPA that is going to be the key driver. Now, you also have to think about state law, if it affords a greater protection for those records than what FERPA does. You can always have a state law that provides greater protection. You cannot have a state law that takes away, but you could have one that says, not, even though FERPA would permit you to disclose this, our state law doesn't. So you need to be aware of that too. But let's get some feedback from Jonathan and Doug here on the practical aspect of this on their campuses.
Well, I'll jump in. So I think that last point that Leroy made is an important one, and one that's framed several of the conversations that I've been a part of on this topic at Baylor, and that is the distinction between Hipaa and FERPA. So that's where a lot of the conversations have started. There was a lot in what Leroy just provided, and it would probably take me more than the time we have left about how all that's played out at Baylor. But a couple of things that I guess I would pick up on in what he said. We have had discussion about what provision in FERPA we were releasing education record data in relation to testing that had to be reported out to local health officials in relation to positive tests. And so this is further complicated by the fact that we have students in various counties and even outside the state. So some of the expectations and requirements differ a little bit across those. What I found out through conversation is there is a large portion of that we have been releasing under the health and safety emergency exception in FERPA. And so we are recording with the information from those tests, the fact that those were released to health officials. There are a portion of them that we have actually been, because of a portal that students go into upon arrival in a clinical setting for the test, actually would have signed consent because they go in with their university login credentials to that portal. And one of the things that was included in that template was the identification that there would be a release of that information when required by local health officials. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag in that, but all of those have fell in one of those two categories of health and safety emergency, or in some cases where we had signed consent. I think the other thing I would say about contact tracing is that for those that we have used to complete those steps of contact tracing, we've been confident that they fall fully under the school official legitimate educational interest provisions. So we haven't had an issue of recordation and so forth with releasing it to them. My understanding is that for the most part, if not entirely, they stay away from personally identifiable information in those follow-up steps as far as a release and such. So a little bit, I want to make sure Doug has a chance to chime in, so I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Before Doug jumps in, I just wanted to follow up with one thing you said, Jonathan. Your university login portal, and the student can give consent there. Is that, how do they do it? They have to check a box that says they give consent, or is it, how does that work?
Come to me, Leroy. I would have to recheck that. I don't recall if it was an active checkbox. I believe it is, and I recall that that's likely necessary to meet the FERPA standards.
Right.
I'm pretty sure, but I don't know that I saw the final version of it, so I probably should go back and double check that. Thank you.
Okay, I just wanted to check on that, because that is right. It's got to be an active, I mean, you can call that electronic consent if they go into the portal, because they have to have a secret PIN or password to get in, but it would have to be an active part or action on the student's part there. They'd have to check something to say it's okay. Doug.
That's a good reminder.
Yeah.
Thanks. So we are at Mason, we have been working on this since March, and we're required to submit a safe return to campus plan to the State Council of Higher Ed in Virginia. Part of that plan is what's called the Mason COVID Health Check, and it's a survey that goes out to all students on campus. It actually goes out to all students, faculty, and staff. And then students who are not coming to campus at all throughout the semester had the opportunity to say, I'm not coming to campus at all. And then if they change their mind, they have to go to the Mason COVID Health Check site and reinitiate those. But on a daily basis, students and faculty and staff are submitting either, I have had no symptoms, I have some symptoms, I've tested positive, et cetera. And then based on the answers to those surveys, you get directed to different outcomes, obviously. We are currently having the Fairfax County Health Department do the contact tracing. And so we are communicating to Fairfax County based on 9931 through 36, the health and safety allowances to say, hey, here's some student information in order for them to kick off the contact tracing. The contact tracers, as Jonathan said, don't actually tell the person. They just say, you were around someone who has tested positive during these times, and then you should do the follow-up as appropriate. And so it's very similar to that different group who's responsible for it, but they're not dealing in personally identifiable information. Now, when there's a class of 12 and one of the people is no longer attending class in person, and then 3 of the students get contacted by contact tracers, Mason actually is really fortunate. We have had 22 cases since August 17th is when we switched over again, and we only have 6 active cases, confirmed COVID cases with students in isolation. So of 35,000 students, we feel like we're doing pretty okay. Obviously, we want to maintain that as we go forward. But in our conversations leading up to this coffee break, the requirement to record the notification to the health department put a tickler out, and I confirmed that we are doing that, which is helpful also. Again, it's nice to be reminded, and then it's also nice to confirm that, yes, you're doing a thing. What else? I think that's it. There are a bunch of questions in the Q&A and in the chat that I think are valuable, or I guess more valuable than me talking about contact tracing efforts at Mason. So I'll stop there as well.
Okay, so let me ask you one question that's come in. What if your state law says notifiable disease information is confidential? Leroy?
Yeah, so again, then you would go with your state law because it would be more restrictive than FERPA. So again, you can have a state law that says you can't disclose health information, whereas FERPA would say as long as it meets the particular and very specific requirements in FERPA for disclosing it, that you could disclose it. So your state law is going to, again, because it affords greater protection, that's the one you would go with.
A little variety. Okay. We have another question. Our institution has a contract with a local hospital system to provide COVID testing for symptomatic students. If the hospital provides a list of students for whom they have processed tests and asks us to provide them with the student's address, can we do this since the addresses are directory information, or does this violate FERPA because it is paired with non-directory information, i.e. the fact that they were tested?
Right, but your institution is not providing non-directory information. You're only providing directory information. The hospital has that, and they're just asking you for the address of the particular students. Now, one of the ways, if you were concerned about it, one of the ways you wanted to do it is you could just automatically provide them with addresses for any students that go in to be tested.
Okay, and one more. If saying a student was positive in a small class so that the student can be identified and the state law says that this information is confidential, then how can a faculty member be making that determination? Isn't this a case-by-case determination and it depends on the factors and circumstances, correct?
Yes, I mean, and again, you've got state law that affords this greater protection. It limits what you can do with the information or how you can disclose it, and that's what you would go with, even though under FERPA you'd be able to do that if you want to do it under your health or safety emergency exception.
Okay, and I have rather, we can deal with this one fairly quickly. I work for a university that supports 11 public institutions. We have students who register at Campus A for a class. However, the class is located on Campus B, two entirely different universities, and our system has institutional security, so campuses don't have access to other campus class rosters information at this time. Does Campus B have a legitimate academic interest to have access to class rosters? Roster information at this time?
They could have, you could share it if they are providing the class, so the student is attending, even though they're enrolled at institution A, the class is being provided by institution B, then sharing that information with institution B would be appropriate because they're actually providing the class. And I'm sure there's some sort of agreement, what have you, that that shows that they are providing it for the other institution. So that's generally not going to be a problem.
I agree with Leroy. I mean, I would expect that relationship between the two institutions should be outlined in some agreement.
Right.
And likely this would have implications well beyond COVID for sharing of data and information between the two.
Right. You would need that, you would need some sort of an agreement there, because FERPA, to use the school official exception, it specifically says within the institution. So that generally is going to limit you to only sharing it there. But in this instance, because you are a school official, you can go beyond that if you contract with someone to provide something for you and you need to provide information to them, and that would fit easily within that. You just, but they should not have access to your whole student information system. They should only have access to that information pertains to the specific students who are who are attending class at that other institution.
Okay, we've got two more questions. One to deal with this issue of COVID on campus, and then another with the previous topic. So for campuses that have emergency management teams, how have these teams collaborated with your records office to ensure that they are in fact following FERPA guidance on releasing information on positive or tested students, especially when no one on the emergency management team is from the records area?
Well, I think that's the key issue. I've been involved since the middle of March, specifically with COVID response teams. We have an emergency operations group. And then over the summer, we had like 18 working groups, everything from housing, dining, the continuity of instruction, testing, all sorts of things. So soup to nuts, an institution has a lot of different priorities and a lot of different areas of concern, but being involved in those conversations, having representation on those groups is critically important from the registrar's office perspective. And so if you are not involved in some of those conversations, there are some politicking that I think you can and should do to get yourself invited or to crash some of those parties, because it's very, very important.
Thank you, Doug. That's a great reminder. Go ahead, Leroy.
No, I just was seconding what Doug had said, that it is really important that those officials at your institution who make those kind of decisions know there needs to be a FERPA representation in this group, because there are things we can do, but they may have to be done a very specific way, and there are things we can't do. And so, but somebody who understands that needs to be there.
Okay, and in our last minute or two, I want to go back to a question that was posed earlier that I think we just need a little more clarification on. This attendee says, what I'm understanding from the panel response is that although students are enrolling in unique class sections, we can merge all those unique sections in our LMS and treat it as one large class without student permission. This then would allow students from multiple different classes to see each other, work together, essentially going from a class of 20 to a class of 60.
So I'll jump in on that because I know this was mentioned earlier, but Doug mentioned it in terms of the same class. So what they do at Mason, because of the distancing issue, half the class meets one time, half another. Same class, but they meet at different times. What you couldn't do is merge different classes in the same LMS. You can, you can share the information if it's all directory information. So the name of students, for example, but what's not directory information is class roster and class schedule. So it's going to depend on, and it's pretty nuanced, and I get different scenarios when I either email or speak with different school officials with this particular issue. But so much of it depends on whether it's the same class, you just break it up because it's too big to be one class, or it's distinctive classes that you enroll in.
I'll just chime in and say this question might actually warrant its very own coffee break, because I think this existed pre-COVID. I mean, I know across institutions that I've worked at, sometimes we divided up a class by sections based on workload and who was individually working with students in a lab, but it functioned very much as one class within a larger lab space or something like that. So I think as Leroy indicates, there is a lot of nuance related to this particular issue that existed pre-COVID, but that likely has come to light, or a much brighter light has been shown on it because of COVID.
Doug, any final comments on that?
Only to second that it's worth more conversation. We at Mason, again, made some difficult decisions because we didn't pivot for fall until after students had registered. And so we had a class where students had registered and we had scheduled it into a 40-seat classroom, and there were 36 students registered for that class. And then in order to facilitate actually delivering that class face-to-face, that 40-person classroom, because of physical distancing requirements, now only seats 21 or 19 students. And so in order to keep that class together, we had to split it into two administrative sections. And this is where I think there's some differentiation that, and nuance, as Leroy pointed out, that if the class is a class, and then you split it into sections administratively, and I see this, we do this with cross-listing as well. You've got a history class and a philosophy class, but all the students are there together. Administratively, you've created two sections. That's all we've done in this case, where we took the 36 students who were registered in this one class, and we split them up into two administrative sections so that we could fit both parts of them into the physical, the restricted physical distancing sections. So it really does vary situationally, but this again is my scenario is COVID specific. It's worth a conversation because there's not native functionality within Banner to enable us to link those sections. They're not linked sections. They're not cross-listed sections. It's a different thing. So yeah, I would say put it on the Acro list to discuss.
All right, we'll check Leroy's availability. All right, that will have to do it for us. Thank you again, Leroy, and a very special thank you to our campus-based colleagues, Jonathan and Doug, who took time away
Indeed.
from their campuses to share with us today. This is one of the most valuable aspects of Acro, the networks we colleagues can provide and to call upon to support one another, especially during these challenging times. A reminder of all that we have coming up this month. We've got our SEM conference coming up next month, a virtual SEM, and we've got the list of all the coffee breaks that are coming up in September as well and throughout the fall. We hope to see you again virtually soon. And a final reminder that when guidance needs to be tailored to your college or university, we hope that you will reach out to Acro Consulting for a convenient and affordable solution. We know that right now, you need to deploy every possible tool in your toolbox to drive student success and enrollment health. So contact consulting@acro.org to complete the contact form on the website to get started. Thank you again for joining us and have a wonderful weekend. Happy Friday.
Thank you all.
Take care, y'all.